Hi, this is Dr. Kat from Central New Mexico Community College. This is our very last video on the digestive system, video O, and the very last one as I mentioned. This is where we're going to discuss our final biomolecule, how it is digested and absorbed, namely the nucleic acids. And we're going to add to this a discussion on how some of our electrolytes, vitamins and even water are absorbed in the gut. The two nucleic acids that we need to digest are, of course, DNA and RNA. And remember that nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides. Nucleotides, in their turn, consist of a pentose sugar. In the case of DNA, that's deoxyribose. In the case of RNA, that is ribose. A phosphate functional group, and then some kind of a nitrogenous base. So when nucleic acids arrive in the small intestine, they have not been touched in the mouth, they have not been touched in the stomach. It's not until the pancreas can secrete ribonucleases and deoxyribonucleases into the small intestine that the nucleic acids can start to be broken up into their more individual nucleotides. And then there are brush border enzymes that can continue to work on these nucleotides, such as nucleosidases and phosphatases, such that we end up with our individual pentose sugars, our individual phosphate groups, our individual nitrogenous bases. Ultimately, all these end products will be absorbed into the epithelial cells of the small intestine by means of active transport, because there are special carrier proteins that can do that. And then eventually these components make it into the bloodstream, which is carried to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. So this finalizes our discussion of how our carbohydrates, our proteins, our lipids, and our nucleic acids are chemically digested and how they are absorbed. But there are some other nutrients to consider. So let's do that next. We've had extensive discussions about water absorption. You know by now that pretty much 90% of the water that is produced by means of secretions and that we bring in by means of diet is absorbed at the level of the small intestine, particularly the duodenum, and the remaining 10% or so, more or less, is taken care of by the large intestine. We do always lose some water in our feces as well. Water always moves by means of passive transport. The diffusion of water is better referred to as osmosis. Now, this passive transport of water can often be influenced by the movement of other solutes, particularly sodium. Water will typically follow sodium, and water is always going to move into an area where the solute concentration is the highest. Now, because of this, water can potentially move in both directions across the intestinal mucosa. It all depends on the concentration gradient. We need various kinds of vitamins in our diet in order to possibly be able to to absorb some of the nutrients that we eat. Think, for instance, of calcium that cannot be absorbed without vitamin D. Or we need some of these vitamins to build products. Think, for instance, of vitamin C, which is needed to make collagen. Or sometimes we need a vitamin to allow for a process to occur. Vitamin B12 in particular plays a very crucial role in cell division, particularly at the level of hematopoiesis in the red bone marrow. So how do we get all of these vitamins that we ingest to be absorbed? Well, remember, a number of our vitamins are steroid based, so they're fats really, they're lipids, and therefore they're fat soluble, which means they can follow the whole steps, all the different steps that we looked at that involved the micelles all the way down to the chylomicrons. And you can spell a word with these fat soluble vitamins called Kata, so that it's easy to remember which ones of our vitamins are indeed fat soluble. Water-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin C and B, they can be absorbed by means of diffusion or passive or active transporter proteins. Vitamin B12 is a little bit unusual in that it requires intrinsic factor in order to be absorbed, and it does that then by means of endocytosis. And then finally, don't forget that the bacteria that live in our large intestine actually synthesize some of our vitamins, vitamin K and B in particular, and then they get absorbed in that particular location that is in the large intestine. We also need to take a look at the absorption of electrolytes. You've already learned about the absorption of sodium, which typically occurs together with the absorption of glucose and amino acids via this transport we discussed in great detail called secondary active transport. Potassium leaks out of cells relatively easily by means of diffusion. It can also move in between cells, and when particles move in between cells, we say that they're moving paracellularly. Now, the movement of potassium is really very much dependent on water absorption, such that when we have diarrhea and we lose a lot of water, we're going to see major potassium problems in our system. So keep that in mind, especially when you take care of patients down the road. Ions are important in our body. Remember, we need to be able to synthesize hemoglobin. And if we think about it, since we women menstruate, we lose a whole lot more iron than men do. We lose 4 times more iron than men do. Where do we store iron? Well, we can store it in various places, including the liver, and can be bound to plasma proteins. But in the gut, in the mucosal cells, the iron binds to a protein called ferritin, and in that sense helps form what we call the mucosal iron barrier. This iron is only going to be released when we need more iron or when iron is lost, because remember, all these cells that form the epithelium in the small intestine slough off regularly. And finally, we should say a few words on the slide about calcium. Remember that calcium is going to be needing vitamin D in order to be absorbed in the gut. And it also depends on parathyroid hormone, with parathyroid hormone being a hormone that is secreted by the parathyroid glands in response to dropping blood calcium levels. So when blood calcium levels drop, parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate absorption or more absorption of calcium in the gut with the help of vitamin D, and we'll even see more absorption of calcium in the kidneys. We haven't mentioned much of the negatively charged ions, the N ions, but they typically follow the electrochemical gradient that is set up by sodium. You might also recall that the bicarbonate ions typically trade places with chloride ions, and chloride ions are going to be actively transported. This finally wraps up our discussion of the digestive system. I really hope that these videos will help you understand the different parts of the digestive system, the histology, the regulation of the digestive system, as well as all the various secretions, their water content, and how much absorption and what kinds of things are absorbed in different locations of the digestive tract. The final thing we discussed is how various nutrients are chemically digested and how they are absorbed. So thank you so much for watching all these videos.